all yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the State Route 37 Policy Committee of Thursday, January 6th, 2022. It's been, I think we last met in the first week of October, so it's been a while. Happy New Year, everyone. And Drew, if we can have a roll call, please.
Yeah, good morning, State Route 37 Policy Committee. I'll be taking roll alphabetically by county. We'll start with the County of Napa. Mayor Leon Garcia.
Here.
Supervisor Alfredo Pedrosa. Supervisor Belia Ramos. County of Marin, Supervisor Judy Arnold.
Here.
Supervisor Damon Connolly.
Here.
Mayor Eric Lucan.
Here.
County of Solano, Mayor Robert McConnell.
Here.
Vice Chair Aaron Hannigan.
Here.
Supervisor Jim Spearing.
Present.
County of Sonoma, Councilmember Victoria Fleming. Supervisor Susan Gorin.
Here.
And Chair David Rabbit.
Great. Thank you, Drew. Appreciate that. Next up, we have public comment. And if there, Drew, do you have any folks who have submitted either correspondence or have raised their hand? And if so, can you help us through that?
Yeah, of course. I see one person who's raised their hand right now. Let me share my screen to get that timer up. We also did receive a pre-submitted public comment from Ed Schulze. I did provide the comment to the policy committee as well as posted online. And so we will start with Kate Powers. Kate, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Kate Powers. I'm a member of Marine Conservation League's board. And I've been attending the policy committee meetings since 2015, have followed the design alternatives assessment process and have participated in the planning and environmental stakeholder working group. I'm here this morning to comment on a November 17th scoping meeting regarding an interim project on State Route 37 between Highway 101 and 121. The purpose of the project was to reduce highway flooding by raising about 5 miles of the roadway to 20 to 14 feet in elevation to withstand a 25-year flood event and sea level rise until mid-century. According to the timeline presented, the construction wouldn't begin until 2027. We urge you that all projects that the policy committee, Caltrans, and MTC are evaluating and working on must align with the long-range planning for all 3 segments to ensure that the corridor-wide vision guides decision and long-term adaptation planning. In May of 2018, a letter to this committee as well as MTC and Caltrans from the Regional Water Quality Control Board stated, elevating State Route 37 on a fill embankment along all or a portion of the corridor will likely result in significant direct fill impacts to San Pablo Bay and the surrounding wetlands, and potentially significant indirect impacts to the physical and ecological processes that support the habitats. Raising SR 37 on a causeway would be more likely to allow for San Pablo Bay and the sensitive habitats surrounding State Route 37 to more effectively adapt to the future sea level rise. I just wanted to say that we're in a time of unprecedented funding availability for transportation infrastructure and climate change resiliency. And it's imperative that all state, regional, and local agencies move in the same direction in investing our public funds responsibly in multi-benefit solutions that progressively build toward long-term resiliency. We urge you to accelerate now towards the planning processes and implementation of the long-term solutions that make the best use of these public funds. Our future generations depend on that. We can't waste our money now. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Kate. Chair Rabbit, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak on item 2.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Powers, for your comments. And I think we'll be addressing that particular issue a couple times today in 2 different areas, certainly in the last item, 4.6. So we appreciate that. We'll move on then to the consent calendar. There's 2 items on the consent calendar today. The minutes of the October 7th meeting, as well as the receiving the comprehensive multimodal corridor plan going forward. And I'll look to my colleagues if there's any questions, comments, or concerns on the consent calendar.
No.
If not, can I have a motion to approve?
I'll move consent.
I'll second.
So I have a motion and a second. And before we take our vote, let's quickly look if there's anyone from the public who'd like to speak on the consent today, Drew.
I don't see any members of the public who have raised their hands to speak on consent.
Okay, and then could you give us a roll call, please, for consent? approval?
Certainly. Supervisor Arnold,
Aye.
Supervisor Connolly,
Aye.
Mayor Garcia,
Yes.
Supervisor Gorin,
Aye.
Mayor Lucan,
Aye.
Mayor McConnell,
Aye.
Supervisor Spearing,
Aye.
Vice Chair Hannigan, and Chair Rabbit.
I'm an aye, by the way.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
As am I. Thank you for that. With that, we'll move on to our round of discussion and information items. First one up is 4.1, talking about public engagement, and we have Art Nye. Am I saying that right?
Nay, yes, thanks.
Go ahead, Art.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. It's a busy beginning to the year for us on State Route 37, where public engagement is concerned. But I'll make my report brief. Our integrated communication team meetings held at Wednesday at 11 a.m., where all the agencies come together and we talk about what's going on and how we're going to articulate what's happening on State Route 37. Our attendance is up, and we've been working together to work on the outreach list that we are using for the upcoming public events I'm about to talk about, and some strategies. So it's been great to see more of our agencies participating, because more brains, the better the output. So thank you all for offering up your team members to be a part of this group. Our upcoming outreach meetings start this January 25th with the PEL, the Planning and Environmental Linkages Outreach meeting is going to be January 25th, 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. Again, it's going to be a remote meeting. Both of the meetings that we have coming up are remote, and we're working together to get information on our websites, broadcast out to our links that this meeting is coming up, and coordinate our social media. So that's been working well. And in a similar way, Caltrans is leading that event, the PEL outreach. And in a similar way, we're working together on the 121 de Vallejo DED public outreach event, which is scheduled for February 2nd. I think that's down in concrete right now. We've been wanting to make sure that that's going along with the publication of the environmental document. This also is going to be an online event. MTC is going to be in the lead, and we're supporting to get all of the information out there. And then lastly, one of the things the team has been looking at communicating on, we're looking in with our maintenance team right now, is the flood control. And I want to knock on wood. Things have been going well on State Route 37 so far with the amount of rain that we've been having. And so we're looking into talking with our maintenance about maybe doing some social media so the public can be aware what we've done out there to make sure that the water stays off the road temporarily. But we're just looking at that right now. And that's basically everything we've got going on. It's a busy beginning to the year.
Great, thank you for all that work. Any questions for Bart? And Drew, I'll look real quickly if there anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this particular item.
No members of the public wishing to speak on this item, Chair Rabbit.
Great, well, we thank you for all that work, and we'll continue on forward. So we'll move on to item 4.2, the US 101 to State Route 121 Design Alternative Analysis wrap up. And I believe we have Stephanie Hom from MTC and Jody Kettleson from TY Lin.
Yes, good morning. My name is Stephanie Hom from MTC. We have Jody Kettleson from TY Lin here to provide our final update on the DAA. First of all, we want to thank Caltrans for giving us this grant, which made this work possible. We started this process, I think, fall of 2020. And so it's been a short but long time for this project. We've done a lot of really good work working with the environmental community and our stakeholders to get input to identify alternatives that will then be available to Caltrans as they move through their appel process to look at the entire corridor. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jody.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me. I always feel privileged to be able to speak to you live like this. I'm going to share my screen and provide this presentation. Let's see. Okay, everybody should be able to see that now, I hope. So yes, the State Route Ultimate Sea Level Rise Resilient Corridor, specifically from US 101 to 121. So basically Marin to Sonoma there. And here we are in January, and we are presenting our final agenda here. And that is that I'll provide a range of the overview of the range of alternatives that we've considered, provide a little bit of kind of reminder of the assessment process that we've gone through, provide you our draft results. And I say draft because we are looking at the comments that we received from the stakeholder working group, which was the last meeting we held in early December. That piggybacks on top of the comments that we've already received from the Resource Agency Partnership, as well as the Environmental Technical Working Group. So the assessment is in its final reviews, but we will like to share with you what the input we've received on the assessment. And so as you can see to the right, these documents that are shown are kind of the materials, if you will, the technical memorandums and the type of data that they have been reviewing and providing their input on. So with that, I will, and I just want to piggyback on Stephanie's comments that there's been an incredible amount of devoted members in the Environmental Technical Working Group, the Stakeholder Working Group, and the Resource Agency Partnership. They have been present nearly 100% at every one of these meetings and reviewed this material in advance and provided very valuable input. So I'm very pleased with the results that we've received. And for some, there, the slide wasn't moving. So right here, what you can see, just to kind of orient everybody on the alternatives that we've evaluated and the context, that we focused on what we're calling the West Reach, the 101 to 121. And this does piggyback on a previous study that MTC hosted, which was the Central Reach from 121 to Mare Island. As you can see, we didn't start in a vacuum. We built upon the alternatives that were already considered in the previous study, and we made sure that those connections aligned. In fact, we took a lot of the information that we learned during our research on the West Reach and were able to update. MTC provided us additional resources so that we could update some of the findings and the design in the Central Reach, specifically the Bay Mud. We did an additional geotechnical search in collaboration with Caltrans to understand what really is possible on this Bay Mud, because, and I'm sure Caltrans has considered that in the flood control project, but building more dirt and that weight on top of the Bay Mud has a lot of uneven, disproportionate settlement. And so we found that if indeed embankment is the route, then you need to reinforce that Bay Mud with deep soil concrete mixing. So what you see here on the West Reach is the range of alternatives that we looked at over 4 alignments. And on those alignments, we came up with specific footprints, whether it be causeway, elevated kind of like as a long linear bridge, and at grade where you're outside of the 100-year floodplain, or embankment where it's possible that deep soil mixing could actually reinforce the Bay Mud and create the opportunity to do a full like levee type road. And so on these 4 alignments, we had 2 alternatives focused on alignment on SR 37, whereas the 2 to the north, the Burville, Hog Island, and the Atherton Bahia alternatives, those are with the intent to go across a shorter portion of the floodplain. So the question comes whether the pre-existing SR 37 is really the right long-term horizon for this roadway. And so we explored the possibility of shorter crossings. Also, the one to the very south, the Overbay, that is something that started in the Central Reach, this concept of perhaps a shorter distance and getting the roadway outside of the existing alignment so that you might relieve some of the pressures on the floodplain and basically have just another bridge over the bay. And so these are the alternatives that we carried through. Just as a kind of summary, each and every one of our alternatives are 2 lanes in either direction, 1 general purpose lane and 1 HOV lane. And that is different than what is today, where you do have 2 lanes and they're both general purpose lanes. I wanted to call that attention. If we remained on alignment, then we replaced the bridges, obviously, to make way for the floodplains. And also every one of our alignments do consider a rail compatibility. They do not consider the footprint to have both road and rail. But right now, the important thing is to decide and make sure that we've narrowed the range of alternatives and where that transportation corridor should be in the long run. And so it's not so important that rail is or is not there, but which corridor should we be on? And that really is the focus of this comparative assessment. So as you can see over the top, we have the alignments, the alternatives over the as the columns and the acreages and the different types of profile. And this gives you a big clue right away, where there's additional acres needed versus and the different lengths. That tends to ripple into that comparative assessment measurements data and shows you where there might be larger impacts than others, just kind of as a gut overview. And so you can see that the causeway on alignment is only 9 additional acres that would be needed in addition to the existing right-of-way. And that's primarily at those interchange areas, because this is planned as in the 100-year horizon that this would be best as an expressway without signals. One of the important pieces of information that I'm asked about repeatedly, and it's a very important issue for policymakers such as yourself, is if one were to consider an off alignment, what would occur with the existing roadway? Or even if it's a causeway on alignment, what would happen with the existing right-of-way underneath the causeway? And we chose to not answer this question, but it is a very important question to mull over. And that is that in the short term, where flooding isn't pending right away on a frequent basis, that access would have to be preserved. And so we didn't presume that any of these alternatives would get a credit for giving back that right of way. However, we did have criteria that looked at the long term, where inundation is more readily making those land uses perhaps less and less viable, and that roadway could perhaps be let go if you were on an unalignment or you were above. And so we just basically addressed it in both categories. So the evaluation criteria was many. It was 23 different measurements. And as you can see, this is just a sample. So for instance, noise was one of the criteria that we evaluated, but even that one criteria had many measures to kind of round up to understand how that noise would vary among the alternatives. And obviously with 23 different criteria and some having multiple sub-criteria in there, it was difficult to compare the data. And so I'm just basically saying that this information will be provided available so that if people want to understand what we based our assessment on, the data will be there in this report. But what we sent out to our environmental stakeholders and resource agencies is not only that data, but a distillation of that data to a high level comparative, basically red being you're performing worse or very, very badly comparative to the green categories. So we nominalized the data and made this pretty easy to look at. And it's not intended for you to read the details, but more to have that opportunity to sit back and look at how the columns compare. So where you obviously see more red, those alternatives don't perform nearly as positively as the alternatives with more green and yellow in the categories. And what we'll do now is I'll go through each of the alternatives. So again, it's not to look at this detail, but we will be coming out with a report, ideally by early February, where all this information will be available so people can really wrap their hands around it in detail. So just to kind of give you that, I just want to point out that on the left, you have the on alignment embankment where you're hybrid, where you're mostly on a levee. Then you have the causeway, the over bay, which is the alignment over literally kind of another bridge over the bay. And then we have the northern alignment, narrow crossing of the floodplain. And those you can see have more impacts on the natural and built resources. So to focus on those key impacts, those things that really separate one alternative from the others, we have on the left a short table, big advantages, substantial disadvantages. And then on the column to the right, we have the latest information or input, if you will, from the stakeholder working group. And obviously they mirror each other quite a bit. So the big advantages to the on alignment hybrid, this embankment alternative, is that it's fairly low acreage, additional acreage is needed, and it performs relatively well in the near term for natural resources. But in the long term, it does not, because of that embankment, that basically a continued barrier. We have designed everything so that the floodplain can be accommodated through the bridges and through culverts, but there still is this very large footprint from that embankment. Also, that deep soil concrete mixing that cement mixing that I alluded to reinforce that embankment is huge volumes. Just 1 mile of an embankment will require between 50 and 70,000 dump trucks. And that's a lot of pollutant material. And not only that, just where are we going to find the fill and the volume of dirt. And so this is a big disadvantage for the embankment. And certainly the input from the stakeholder working group emphasized this long-term natural impacts, the worst emissions during construction, and that enormous fill were all items that they took note of and felt that that even the costs didn't seem to justify. So as we go on to the next alternative, again, same on alignment, but the causeway, this one has, like I mentioned, the lowest acreage is needed, perform best on the transportation, meaning that in the long term, you have this causeway that's lifted. You can still use the right of way underneath during the short term to access the land uses. And then in the interim, and then in the long term, when those floods do become more and more frequent, then that area would also support the natural resources and the kind of return to restoration viability. And then you have, however, it is 30% more expensive than the least costly alternative. And so what is the least costly alternative? It's that Burdell, this alternative way up on the far north that gets to take advantage of the existing right-of-way along Lakeview Road. So we basically tried to optimize each and every one of these alternatives in the context of its alignment. And then the Burdell Island, we were able to consider using the existing alignment that is on Lakeview Road that's for the most part above this 100-year floodplain projection. And that makes that one very inexpensive comparatively. But if you were to just consider the embankment and the causeway together, there's only approximately a 15 to 18% difference between the embankment and the causeway being slightly more expensive. So that's still a disadvantage. I mean, more cost is more cost. So the stakeholder working group were surprised that it performed so well. There was a lot of very positive comments about this alternative across the board, regardless of one's affiliation. There was no dissent on whether this alternative should be carried forward or not. So then we have 2 more slides here. I'm trying to be as brief as possible. But the Over Bay alternative has a lot of interest, a lot of legs to this alternative because of the perception that it's short and outside of these very valuable habitat areas. However, ironically, it does perform worse on the natural resources than the on alignments for sure. And primarily due to the area in the Novato Marin County, where in order to offset the expensive causeway that would go across the bay, we looked at the embankment as being more kind of trying to minimize the cost. It still is 3 times more expensive than the least costly alternative, and is well over 2 times more expensive than the on alignment alternatives. So it's even with that attempt to offset, it still remains very costly. And also, so even with those attempts, it still performed worse on tidal and ecological connectivity, again, focusing on that Novato issue. And it is the longest alternative because we cannot avoid having that leg. In order to meet the purpose of this project, we are trying to preserve the actual regional traffic flow, and we need that connection because there's a lot of use on going north-south in this area as well as east-west. So people were surprised. They felt that the input from the stakeholder working group were surprised that it didn't have better ratings on the natural resources, that the impacts of the additional right-of-way were much higher than they thought. However, again, they felt that there was an opportunity to perhaps refine and look at this in more detail when it comes to the PAL to see how it might perform in the next round of refinements. Finally, you have the 2 alternatives that are to the north that again cross the shortest portion of the floodplain. The advantages are just that, and shortest crossing of the floodplain, as well as they are the least costly alternatives in general. The least costly overall was the very north one, and I explained because of its majority at grade and a short portion of the causeway over the floodplain. But these 2, as you saw the very first table of the color-coded table, that they perform worse on the natural resources than all of the other alternatives. And there are still a lot of right-of-way that would need to be added to this in order to make these 2 alternatives, whereas obviously the on alignment has quite a lot of right-of-way at its disposal. So what's interesting here is that the stakeholder working group, those that commented, again, it wasn't unanimous that I got comments from 100% of the group, but those that have commented felt that that even though nobody had positive comments towards these, and they felt that they were least desirable of all the alternatives. There were a few, very, very few that said, okay, these are not alternatives that I would support. However, nobody absolutely came out and said, you know, these are a waste of time. We don't want to see this impact. These are fatally flawed. They were interested in continuing to have these discussions and understand. And I think it comes back to that issue that I mentioned in the very beginning. What would occur to the existing SR 37 were one to consider the other alignments? I think that that's going to be a big discussion in the upcoming analysis. And like I said, we just looked at it in both ways. So in the long term, these perform okay with natural resources, but there's a reticence that the wetlands that these alternatives would cross are fairly intact, ancient, pristine wetlands. And so even though over long term, the waterway could continue to support these wetlands, there's still an impact to pristine ecological areas during the construction process. So just to round up here, the big takeaways are that there is a lot of support for the causeway. It is obviously a little more expensive. However, the hydrologic and wildlife connectivity over the long run is basically performs the best on all compared to any of the alternatives. It It maintains the current alignment, so transportation-wise, it has good flexibility, short and long-term, very low life cycle costs, and it's likely to minimize near-term as well as long-term environmental impacts. While people felt, like I mentioned, it was premature to dismiss alternatives, there seemed to be very strong dissent on the two alternatives to the north. So the need for a lot more right-of-way, the impacts to these pristine wetlands, and because you're changing the dynamic of the transportation system, meaning that you're going north sometimes to go south, there is still a concern that the transportation benefits won't be as great as if we were on alignment or over the bay. So with that, while I'd love to say that we have a single conclusion, what we do offer is a lot of fantastic data and devoted members that have learned a lot and will continue to be involved in the PAL and be able to build upon this information. And it's been a fantastic experience for us all. So thank you. If there's any questions, I'll be available.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Stephanie. I'll look to my colleagues and see if there's any questions, comments, or concerns with staff. I see Director Lucan. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jody, for the great report. I'm curious with regards to A1B. I know the scope of the project wasn't necessarily to evaluate parallel projects happening in the corridor or being proposed in the corridor, but I know a question that I have, and I think many people have, is how do we reconcile this recommendation with other projects, in particular the flood control project that's also happening on a parallel path that potentially could result in a lot of fill, and then this recommendation of the causeway being the #1 recommendation to avoid the environmental impacts of all of that fill. How does somebody like myself and the public reconcile these two parallel projects and or recommendations?
Yeah, and there are two different objectives. There's the interim or the short term. How are we going to preserve a corridor that is heavily dependent upon versus really ponying up to the long term, very large mega project ticket item. And so I'm sure I'm not the one to answer that question. But I will say that I trust and know for a fact that Caltrans has looked at this bay mud issue. And so I'm sure that if the short term were to be an embankment, that the deep soil mixing is certainly part of those considerations. But I'm going to have to defer to Caltrans when you get that presentation, because I think this long-term issue is really looking at the 100-year perspective. And so I know that Ricky will be prepared to answer that question in more detail.
Sounds good. And I know that might be coming up later, so sorry if I jumped the gun on that, but I know there's a question on tops of a lot of people's minds.
I totally am there with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions before we move on? And maybe if we could stop the screen sharing. I just can't see everyone.
Yes.
I'm sure.
Absolutely. Sorry. Thank you.
I don't see any hands raised. Susan Gorin, please go ahead. You're muted, Susan.
I know, I'm trying to unmute. It's way up at the top of the screen. I can't even find it. Thank you so much for the presentation. And you're right, the dizzying colors of the graph just leads everybody to confusion. It will be a struggle to figure out the best alternative because there is such a wide range of criteria and values moving into this. But I appreciate the information that you presented regarding the amount of fill that is required to build an embankment. When we first started this process, we assumed that the solution would just be a series of raised embankments, levees. And it's not so clear cut to choose that as an option, except in well-defined areas. So I think your analysis is helping us, but it's still a bit of a muddle, and we'll figure out how this moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything? And Drew, is there anyone from the public who would like to speak on this particular item?
Yes, I see two members of the public who wish to speak. Let's get them started. Steve Bertelbaugh, we will start with you. I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Steve Bertelbaugh with the Transportation and Land Use Coalition of Sonoma County. The issue that I'd like to wrestle with is how do all of these alternatives compare with the alternative that remains out of the floodplain? And at what stage would we come to deal with that one? And I want to compliment Jody on the way she's been able to pull all this together. I participated in a lot of the discussion early on, and she really has done a good job of summarizing it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Next I have in line is Barbara Saltzman. Barbara, I have permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm Barbara Salzman, and I'm with the Mare Audubon Society. And I too want to compliment Jody. She has done a great job in presenting complex material to in a way that people can understand and simplified. And anyway, thanks, Jody. But I wanted to say a little bit more about the two northern alternatives. Because we've been very involved in projects on the Marin side of the Petaluma River. The Burdell, the Burdell alternative, I'm just not sure why that would be such a small area going through a floodplain. If you're only looking at the Sonoma side, that's understandable. But the Marin side, the additional impacts are that it would impact fish and game property, seasonal wetlands, as well as SMART's mitigation at Miramonte Marina. So that would have significant impacts that don't seem to be being recognized. And then of course, the Bahia one, we did a large restoration project there with a lot of federal and state money about 10 years ago. And although it's been improved, it was moved slightly further north. It's still in the floodplain. It still would impact mitigation and tidal marsh and public open space. So I hope those points are all recognized. And it's just not they're not good alternatives for the environment in Marin County or Sonoma County, especially with the Petaluma marsh impacts. That marsh is the largest tidal marsh that's never been filled or significantly impacted in the state of California. So it's important to keep that in a pristine state. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Barbara. Chair Rabbit, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak on this item.
Great, thank you, Drew, and thank you to those in the public, and thank you again to Stephanie and Jody for the presentation. These are informational items, so with that, we'll move on. If everyone's
I do have a comment, just real quickly, Supervisor.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. Jody, I just want to appreciate your research. And personally, I think it's very easy to read. I do appreciate the colored columns. It's, you can see the comparisons, and this is really a great tool, I think, as we go forward in terms of addressing what options are in our best interest, and where we might find these weaknesses that we'll need to either support or to make a different decision in terms of an alternative. So I absolutely appreciate this research and the presentation. Thank you so much. I imagine this slide deck will be available. Okay, great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Director Arnold. Judy, you're muted.
What is the next step in coming up with the answers?
If I can address that, I'm so happy that right after me is going to be Chris Caputo speaking to the Pell. So we have been working very closely with Caltrans, and they have decided to adopt this Pell process, which really is legislatively supported to help narrow the range of alternatives. And they're looking at the entire corridor. And so we can only hope that at least the information that we've provided gives them a step up and helps them refine and get to these answers as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Not seeing any hands raised. I just want to say thank you again. And I will admit, looking at the Burdell or the Lakeville Road alternative, while understanding that it's the cheapest alternative, and to be honest, representing that area, knowing who lives and resides and works in that area, that gives me a lot of angst, to say the least. And I do think in terms of the cost, while very, very important, obviously, I think this project of all projects, we really need to do the right thing. Obviously, I tell you as an architect, it's that last 10% or 15% of project costs that can make or break a project. I think it's important to make sure that we make the investment for the long term in the right way. So I do appreciate the work. I appreciate the analysis as we move forward. So with that, Jody did give the introduction of item 4.3, which is the corridor planning and environmental linkages, or the Pell update. And we do have Chris Caputo from Caltrans. Chris?
Thank you, Chairperson Rabbit. Let me click a couple buttons here. Hopefully you're all seeing my screen. So good morning, committee members. My name is Chris Caputo. I'm one of the Caltrans co-leads for the State Route 37 Planning Environmental Linkages Study. Today's presentation is just a very brief review of the latest progress on the Planning Environmental Linkages Study. As you recall, and for those who've joined us today, our Pell study, the first study of its kind conducted in California on the state highway system, is an integrated planning approach that seeks to link short and long-range transportation planning and corridor planning done by state and local governments to the planning processes performed by environmental protection, historic preservation, resource conservation, and land use management agencies. I'd also kind of like to follow up and note that, as Jody just discussed, it's very important to point out that the work that she and her team have done on the DAA, along with other studies completed in the corridor, will be reviewed and included as appropriate in the Pell study in order to maximize efficiency and avoid duplication in our study. This schedule shows where we are in the Pell process and some of the key milestones and accomplishments we've achieved since the October Policy Committee meeting. You can also see our path forward for the first half of this new year on the right side of the screen. In my October update, I reported that the team had just finalized the project purpose, which involved many months of extensive collaboration with a broad group of partner agencies, stakeholders, and regulatory agencies. We're pretty pleased and believe that that process resulted in a robust purpose statement that has begun to guide the study as we've moved forward. Over the remaining months of October of 2021, we continue to refine our evaluation criteria. We developed preliminary alternatives, and we're preparing to subject those alternatives to a tiered screening process. In this slide, you can see the list of meetings that took place in support of the progress I just summarized. Over the coming months, the Pell team will meet again with a stakeholder working group and resource agency partners to discuss the evaluation criteria and alternatives being developed for the Pell. Most notably, we're conducting our second public meeting for the Pell on Tuesday, January 25th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. We would encourage everybody here today to attend that meeting and participate. During that meeting, we'll present the final project purpose, the evaluation criteria, and preliminary alternatives that will be subject to screening in the Pell over the coming months. This slide and the following two slides provide some additional context on the process as it relates to the progress we've made in recent months. First, here is the final Pell purpose statement, which is shown here. And I showed this back in October, but I wanted to call this up since this is sort of the foundational statement or jumping off point for the remainder of our study. And this slide is an example of the process by which the purpose statement evolves into the evaluation criteria I mentioned. On the left, you can see an element of the project purpose, which is one of those bullets that were up on the previous screen. And then moving to the right, you can see how the Pell team developed factors that were then distilled into prospective criteria that were subsequently subjected to feedback by each of the technical working groups, stakeholders, and resource agencies. And then this slide presents the framework that we intend to employ to screen alternatives. This process is currently getting underway and will be the focus of our efforts over the next several months. At the far right of the diagram are next steps that would occur once the Pell study is complete. The bullets there collectively represent the environmental process that would support the ultimate solution for the State Route 37 corridor. The anticipated target date for this work to begin is in the fall of this year. And then finally, we have established and sort of, as I mentioned earlier, and convened 3 technical working groups. The 3 groups are focused on design, traffic, and the environment. Each technical working group is providing their respective technical expertise as they pertain to establishing the evaluation criteria, preliminary alternatives, and the screening process. We'll continue to be meeting with the technical working groups on a monthly basis throughout the remainder of winter and spring as we screen the alternatives for the Pell. And that's my update. Very brief.
Great.
Thanks, Chris.
I'll stop sharing quickly.
No, I appreciate that. And I'll look to my colleagues for questions, comments, concerns for Chris. Not seeing any hands raised. I'll look to Drew to see if there's anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this particular item.
I just saw a hand go up. So a couple hands are up now. So we'll get that going. All right, Steve Bertelbaugh, I have you up first. I permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit and members. Steve Bertelbaugh again with the Transportation Land Use Coalition. There is one factor that is sort of new to the process, and that is that Marin County is supposed to build about 11,000 additional housing units in the next 8 years. And Sonoma County will also be building quite a few additional housing units on the west end of the commute area. This could substantially change the number of people that are commuting over Highway 37. And I'm wondering how the process is going to incorporate any estimates as to the changes that will occur over the next 8 years in terms of VMT on that route. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Next I have is Barbara Saltzman. Barbara, permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
I'm still Barbara Saltzman. I'm still with the Marin Audubon Society. I just wanted to connect these two presentations and the information that we all received from them, especially Jody's, with the interim project that was addressed by Kate Powers earlier on. It's just mystifying how why a Caltrans project that has produced is presenting as its only alternative an embankment that we've just heard is expensive. It has many environmental impacts. as their only alternative for this interim project. I'm surprised you didn't have the interim project on the agenda today, actually. But I think that not only is this a waste of all this good information and staff time, I just don't understand how you know, within the same agency, there is such a discrepancy, why that interim project is not building on the information presented here today, especially by Jody. So it would be great to discuss that.
All right, thank you, Barbara. Chair Rabbit, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for those comments. We appreciate that. I think that I know from this board, we have consistently said that all options are on the table, and as was just mentioned, and I think that obviously our goal is to have environmental remediation as we solve all the issues associated with Highway 37. So I think there's an opportunity there. If there are no other questions, comments, or concerns on this particular item, we'll move on then to 4.4, which is Sears Point to Mare Island Improvement Project, the interim project on that side with Kevin Chen from MTC. Kevin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Chen, MTC staff. I'm very happy to share that we've just completed the draft environmental document for the Sears Point to Mare Island Improvement Project. I would like to thank the entire project team, including our partners from Caltrans, for getting us to this key milestone. We are in the process of making this document accessible before it gets posted on the Caltrans website. And we are planning to circulate this document for public comments next Thursday, January 13th. And that will start the 45-day review period. We're also lining up newspaper ads for public notices, and we'll be sending out email blasts when the document is released. We are also planning on holding a public meeting on February 2nd in the evening. As Bart had mentioned earlier, it will be a virtual meeting. So more information on that meeting will be included in the public notices. So separate from the draft environmental document, we have also been working with our partner agencies in identifying funding opportunities for this interim project, including various state and federal fund sources. And one of those is the SB1 funding that includes the Solutions for Congested Corridors, as well as the Trade Enhancement Corridor program. I just want to mention that because earlier in the agenda on item 3.2, you've received the comprehensive multimodal corridor plan. A completion of the CMCP is basically a requirement in order for us to apply for the SB1 Solutions for Congested Corridor program funding. So I just wanted to make that linkage between that CMCP and this interim project. So that concludes my update. Again, just please be on the lookout for public notices and announcements when the draft environmental document gets released next week. And we would encourage everyone here to attend the public meeting on this coming up on February 2nd in the evening. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Any questions for Kevin? Not seeing any hands raised. Drew, can you just confirm that there's no one from the public who'd like to speak on this particular item?
Confirm, no members of the public wishing to speak on this item.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin, for the work. Moving on then to 4.5, and I see that we do have Rebecca Long with us. Tolling legislation, potential authority through the Bay Area Infrastructure Finance Authority. Rebecca, please.
Good morning, Chair Rabbit, committee members. I'm Rebecca Long, Acting Director of Legislation and Public Affairs at MTC. And I'm just going to give you a brief update regarding the tolling legislation, and also a little bit about sort of the governance work that we have been engaging on that would inform the legislation as well. All right, it's not advancing. There we go. So the legislation, I think many of you may know, is going to be authored by Senator Dodd. He introduced a bill a couple years ago, SB 1408. That bill was shelved due to COVID, but he is going to take this up again. And that's kind of the starting point for the legislation. So MTC has been working closely with the 4 North Bay County transportation agencies on updated language. At a high level, what the bill is going to need to do is to identify who is operating the toll facility, what the toll facility is, so the geographic limits of the authority, how the toll revenue can be spent, and then details about the toll policies themselves. Without getting too far into the weeds, it is important to note that under California constitutional law, there is a concern related to tolls being treated as fees versus taxes. And I think you all are aware we've been in some legal challenges as it relates to Regional Measure 3. And so that what needs to happen to ensure that this goes through without any further legal challenges is that the state really has to be in the driver's seat. It is the state that is requiring that tolls be imposed, and the state will need to have a strong role through the statute as to what the toll amounts are. It really can't be a full kind of handoff to the region and locals to have full discretion there. So that's a bit unfortunate, maybe not the ideal policy structure that we'd like to have. We always like to have more discretion and flexibility, but that's the reality that we're operating under. So we're working with counsel on our own outside counsel on the language to ensure that this piece of it is sound. So what we've been thinking about in terms of the governance is that the law would create a State Route 37 tolling authority, but that an existing entity, the Bay Area Infrastructure Financing Authority, or BAIFA, could essentially serve as the State Route 37 tolling authority. BAIFA was created as a joint powers authority of MTC and BATA, the Bay Area Toll Authority, in 2006 to finance state contribution towards the toll bridge seismic retrofit program, and it also oversees the regional express lanes. The current BAIFA membership includes the MTC chair, the Bay Area Toll Authority oversight chair, and then MTC commissioners from the counties that currently have express lanes that are operated by MTC. And you can see this map here shows, we've got lanes that are, under development, not quite open yet, in Solano County, Alameda County, and Contra Costa County. What we are working on, and this is very much an active effort that's coming before MTC and BAIFA itself over the next month or two, is changing the governance of BAIFA so that it is it's coterminous with MTC. So it would include the full commission, and that would provide greater geography, and also including all of the North Bay representatives on MTC, as well as broadening opportunities for BAIFA itself to engage in some other funding needs, for example, related to BART cars, where there's an interest in issuing some bonds based on federal transit funding, and by broadening the BAIFA governance, that will facilitate that as well. Because State Route 37 is very focused on tolling, what we're contemplating is creating a tolling committee that would, again, oversee both express lanes and the State Route 37 piece of this as a subcommittee of BAIFA. So that's the basic concept that we have in mind at this stage. Again, this addresses a number of opportunities. It helps create a regional body for both for tolling and for other financing, and also helps streamline, rather than creating too many separate entities. We've been working a lot over the last couple of years on this concept of seamlessness, and trying to, from the customer standpoint, as well as from an administrative standpoint, limit the proliferation of too many administrative bodies with their own sets of rules that really don't create harmony for the driver or the transit rider. So a few things about, what we would be hoping to achieve through the legislation, and that what we believe the BAIFA model will facilitate is For express lanes, the statutes already require that the revenue be used within that corridor. So this restructuring doesn't change that. For State Route 37, the legislation that we're working on would basically specify, what are the eligible uses of the State Route 37 revenue, very much limited to the corridor, and spells out both the interim project, the ultimate project, and ecological restoration projects that would be eligible. And as I mentioned, this BAIFA restructuring also facilitates the BART car financing. So there's ways to ensure that there's not any kind of cross subsidy across these different functions, but it also helps with the streamlining. And then this is a little bit unrelated to this purpose, but it does also open the opportunity down the road that if we want to do further integration of existing express lanes that are operated separately, we can bring them in, since we're creating a more regional governance. So in terms of just the next steps here, we anticipate Senator Dodd will be introducing the new bill, in the next over the next month. The deadline is late February. I think he wants to get it in sooner than that. BATA and MTC will be amending the joint powers agreement over the next few months. And then in the spring, BAIFA will be amending its toll ordinance to allow for some means-based discounts, and will be proceeding with the BART car financing. And then, we're hopeful. I know Senator Dodd certainly wants to see this bill enacted in 2022. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. And Lisa Klein is also here with me, and she's really the lead on the BAIFA restructuring, if you have more specific questions about that.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'll look to my colleagues to see if there's any, and I see Director Lucan. Please go ahead.
I think my question might be a little bit more related to the legislation, but if it's going to be introduced in early 2022, maybe in February, I think this group doesn't meet again until March. So from a timing perspective, does that mean that we won't necessarily really be able to weigh in on the final language in the legislation, or we'd be commenting maybe after the fact?
I think we can certainly work with, those of you on the call today about that. We're working on drafting it right now. There's always an iterative process, with the other stakeholders on this call, as well as with Senator Dodd's office and legislative council. So, if committee members want to see the language itself, I think we can facilitate that, but there just would be, a quick turnaround for feedback if you want to comment before it's introduced. There's always many opportunities. I don't think I've ever worked on a bill that wasn't amended multiple times through the process. So there's also that opportunity.
Of course, I appreciate that, and thank you for that opportunity. We'll probably, I know many of us will be tracking it even in these very early stages along the way. So thank you.
You bet.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have anything? Not seeing anyone. Rebecca, thank you so much as usual for the great work, and Lisa for yours as well. Thank you. And I will ask Drew if there's anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this particular item.
I do not see any members of the public who wish to speak. A hand just went up. All right, so we're going to start with Ed Schulze. Ed, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Yeah, maybe it's too far in advance, but are they talking about which end of 37 will have a toll collection? And again, I have a consideration for lanes if we do a causeway, hopefully, according to Jody's consumer report type. It's real easy to read. I like the graphs and charts. We're going to have, if we have a causeway, it'd be 3 lanes each way. If we have 2 lanes each way, one being an HOV, you eliminate the ability to pass a slow-moving truck. So to me, it should be a 3-lane each way. One is an HOV lane. Again, that's relative to her report, but that's one of my major considerations. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schulze. Chair Rabbit, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak.
Great. And I don't know if Andy wants to opine on the, there's a lot more flexibility in how one tolls these days with gantries and electronic tolling and whatnot. But if there's something you could provide a little more information on how what that might look like going forward. Of course, decisions haven't been made yet.
Yeah, sure thing, Chair Rabbit. Andrew Vermeer, Deputy Executive Director, Bay Area Toll Authority and MTC. Look, it will basically operate like a bridge. We do think that it makes sense to toll in both directions, not double price, but some form of pricing in both directions so we can deal with peak traffic. But that is down the road. It will be just a gantry in each direction at some point. Whether or not we extend into Marin, and that conversation is a whole other dynamic. And I think some of that will play out in the discussion on how the legislation is written and what kind of direction it gives us. But our initial plan is to operate it much like a bridge.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate that information. And I appreciate, again, the work here. And certainly we need to also appreciate Senator Dodd being such a good ally on this project and all the other transportation issues that we've been dealing with. So appreciate that. With that, we'll move on to 4.6, Caltrans SHOPP project update. We have Ricky Jiao from Caltrans to make that presentation.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit, and good morning, policy committee members and general public. This is Ricky Gao, Regional Project Manager for SR37 from Caltrans, and I'd like to present Caltrans SHOPP project update. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. As I updated last policy committee meeting, we have 6 SHOPP projects on 37. And they are all still on target and on schedule for mostly deliver on 2024 fiscal year to reach the ready to list milestone. So the 6 SHOPP projects are, the first one is the pavement rehab project, capital maintenance project that is in Marine from US 101 to Petaluma River Bridge, and second project is the Petaluma River Bridge preservation project, and also we have 2 intersection improvement project at the 37 and 121 intersection, which I will highlight in a few slides down, and also we have the pedestrian enhancement project at Wilson Avenue and the Fairgrounds Drive, which is also on schedule for reach the ready to list milestone in 2024 fiscal year. And lastly, we have the flood reduction project that has a lot of public interest. So this project is from US 101 to SR 121, and I'm going to highlight in a second. And this project will be expected to reach the ready to list milestone on 2026 fiscal year, depending on the funding availability. So this is the first project I'm going to highlight, the flood reduction project, and as highlighted red on the map from US 101 to SR 121. So we have begun environmental studies in summer of 2021, and after that we conducted the public scoping meeting on November 17th. At the scoping meeting, I have to stress that we mentioned that all the alternatives are on the table. We presented one of the considerations, which is the embankment. However, that's not the only alternative we are studying. We are considering a range of alternatives, as the public commented on. We are looking at the causeway solution and as well as embankment to address the recurring flooding due to seasonal rain and high tide event, as well as the sea level rise issue. So we collected valuable information from public scoping meeting and also at the commenting period. And with that, we are studying all the alternatives that has been brought to us. And also, we are trying to align this project and all the alternatives with the results from the PAIL study and also the DAA study. So we are considering the mid-century flood level and also the ultimate sea level rise level, as well as other elevations that it can fit into the available funding. So with that, we'll study all the alternatives and also prepare a draft environmental document and circulate the draft environmental document in summer of 2022. After that, we'll prepare a final decision document and select the preferred alternative and then complete the environmental phase in 2023. And then follow that, we'll conduct the design and begin construction in 2027. And again, the future dates, especially for the design and construction, that's pending on the funding availability. So that's the flood reduction project. And also, I'd like to highlight the two projects at the SR 37 and 121 intersection. These two projects are on schedule to circulate the draft environmental document in April of 2022. One is to reconstruct the intersection, and we are considering two alternatives. One is to build alternatives. One is the continuous T intersection, and another one is the roundabout at this intersection. And also we have the lane extension project, which is to extend the eastbound the lane drop to where passing the intersection. So, and also I'm processing a project change request to combine these two projects into one after the PAED phase, after the environmental phase, to satisfy the independent utility requirement by NEPA. So that's the update for the SHOPP projects, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Ricky. And I'll look to my colleagues if we can stop the screen share so I can see. I see that director. I keep calling us directors today. I'm just going to go with that, whether we are or we aren't. Director Lucan.
Thank you very much, Ricky, and thank you for clarifying that all options and alternatives do remain on the table there. Just curious, as this process continues, how do we avoid a situation where maybe projects that don't complement each other are occurring on parallel paths? And I'm speaking specifically to an embankment option for the flood control that certainly could be at odds with the ultimate project that maybe says all that fill is not good. So how do we, I know we're very early on, but how do we keep parallel projects from being maybe on a collision course with each other?
So thank you, Councilmember Lucan. We'll study all the alternatives and weigh in the pros and cons, and also coordinate with all the parallel projects and as best as we can to make sure there's no conflict and all the projects align with each other, and make sure the tax dollars are best spent to address the community members' interest.
Thank you very much. I'll move to Adina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit. And just to add to what Ricky said for Mayor Lucan's question, I think the objective here of all these studies is to converge really. We are trying to minimize any throwaway in the corridor. We do recognize that there are a couple of constraints that we need to keep in mind. One, of course, is the obvious one, which is the funding part or the funding piece of this. We do recognize that the causeway seems to be the alternative that most of the public has been really putting their weight behind. This seems to be the best alternative. However, that does have a lot of funding obstacles. So what can we do here as a collective team to look at the opportunities that we have on how we're going to advance the agenda of this corridor? I think it's going to be really the purpose of this committee, and as well as the project team as we move along. But the idea here is to really make sure that everything is converging, that we are actually going in the same direction.
Great. Well, thank you, Dean. And I would be remiss if I didn't commend Caltrans for the work that you have done in the corridor with flood control measures in the past. We've been hit with some very significant storms as of recent, and that section in Marin has done very well. So I do want to recognize the work that has been done to keep the roadway open these past 2 winters with the storms that we've had. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Director Connolly.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Really just associating with some of the issues raised by Commissioner Lucan, and appreciate Dina's comments as well. I know we're going to hear from members of the public raising some of these same issues, and it really is concerns on a couple levels with the interim approach. Understanding that no decisions have been made, that a lot of alternatives remain. That having been said, kind of pursuing a large embankment approach, there are cost issues with that. At what point does an interim project, in effect, have a level of throwaway cost, for lack of a better term, that it doesn't really make sense at all to go forward with it, given our goals for a longer term project. And then the ecological impacts, which I know, in addition to flood control per se, we really are looking at this as an environmental project. How can we improve the ecology in that area? So those issues are kind of weighing on my mind as well. And as I mentioned, I think the public is weighing in on this. We have received a couple of letters, and I think we'll get some testimony today. So I'll be taking a close look at those issues. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from my colleagues? Not seeing any other hands raised. Drew, why don't we go into public comment on this particular item?
All righty, sounds good. I see 3 members of the public with their hands up right now. And we will start with Jessica Davenport. Jessica, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. This is Jessica Davenport with the State Coastal Conservancy, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. The Conservancy, along with our colleagues in the State Route 37 Baylands Group, have been participating in the Highway 37 planning process for 4 years, including the 2 DAA processes and now the PEL. Caltrans' decision to propose a 14-foot high embankment as an interim project with the narrow purpose of flood reduction and no reference to the need to integrate ecological protection and restoration of the surrounding landscape is very concerning to the Conservancy and our partners in the Baylands Group. And I do appreciate the comments made today to expand on Caltrans' intention to include all alternatives, including the causeway, but that was not initially presented at the public meeting in November. So we just want to remind everyone, which I think you're well aware, that an embankment would disrupt connectivity and impact the ability of the Conservancy and our partners to implement the restoration projects in the San Pablo Baylands. And the project was initially framed in a way that appeared to sideline the ongoing PEL study. And again, pleased to hear today that that is not the case, that the PEL information and the DAA information will be incorporated into the flood reduction project's environmental analysis. So we do strongly urge Caltrans to make sure that the draft, in our letter, we urge the delay of the draft EIR until the PEL is complete, which, as you saw, will happen this summer, and incorporate the findings of the DAA into both the PEL and the environmental analysis for the flood reduction project. And there are several advantages. It would preserve trust with the stakeholders, regulators, and technical experts who have dedicated so many hours to developing the purpose and need statement and evaluation criteria. It would provide an overall environmental analysis for the entire corridor for both short and long-term solutions so that they can work together. and enabling the flood reduction project to be analyzed within this larger framework. And it would prevent potentially conflicting outcomes between the PEL and the draft EIR for the flood reduction project. And we are concerned that the proposed interim project could become the ultimate solution given the huge investment associated with a project intended to raise an embankment to address sea level rise to 2050. And as you all know, this planning for this corridor has often been cited as a model for a new and improved collaborative approach to integrated planning for transportation and ecosystems. So let's not lose this opportunity to develop a truly exemplary nature-based climate adaptation program that elevates the road out of harm's way and enables the full restoration of the San Pablo Baylands and the many species that depend on them, as well as benefiting the communities that enjoy these restored habitats. Accelerating the planning processes and implementation of the long-term solutions would make the best use of these public investments. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Jessica. Next I have in line is Steve Bertelbaugh. Steve, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit, members. Steve Bertelbaugh again. I concur in the comments you just heard. And the Sierra Club did submit a letter supporting them. The question that I want to address is how do we advance the shift of people into the use of transit? When I've driven the 2-lane segment of Highway 37 during rush hour, I find that the traffic moves along at about 45 miles an hour when you are in that lane. It's getting into it that's the problem. Traffic backs up in the 4-lane segments trying to get into that 2-lane segment. How can we advance the lane jump process so that carpools and transit vehicles would be able to get into the 2-lane segment without being caught in the backed up traffic in the 4-lane segments? I'd like to see us make some queue jumps so that transit can be started sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Next I have in line is Ariana Rickard. Ariana, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to comment. My name is Ariana Rickard, and I'm with Sonoma Land Trust, and we also submitted a comment letter on the SR 37 flood reduction project. I want to say we agree with the comments already provided by Kate Powers from the Marin Conservation League and Jessica Davenport with the State Coastal Conservancy. So just some of the main points in our letter. Oh, and it's wonderful to hear that there are alternatives besides the embankment that are being considered. And like Jessica stated, we are deeply concerned that the proposed interim approach will interfere with existing planning processes to design and implement a long-term solution that will address sea level rise. And we urge Caltrans to implement a long-term solution such as an elevated causeway rather than spending considerable time and resources on a short-term concept like the proposed embankment. Short-term interim efforts could delay or even prevent the construction of a long-term solution and may worsen outcomes if actual sea level rise projections accelerate or exceed forecasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. Next I have in line is Barbara Saltzman. Barbara, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm still Barbara Salzman, and I wanted to reiterate my earlier comments, which should have been made here. I had understood that the interim project was not really a SHOPP project, so I did not expect it to be addressed here. But we certainly agree with the comments made earlier, particularly by Jessica Davenport. It is a concern that this may become a permanent project, if a permanent solution, if it is chosen, the embankment. And I wanted to raise and reiterate the earlier comments from staff about the incredible amount of fill that would be needed for this embankment. Where it would come from is beyond me. You'd have to take down a mountain somewhere. And then how taking it away would even have, if there was another alternative chosen. So I think this alternative is highly questionable, and I'm glad to hear from staff that they will be addressing and considering other alternatives. I do sense a little bit of hesitation about, leaving the embankment. So I think it's really will behoove us all to keep close watch on this and make sure that this interim project stays in alignment with the others, because they seem to be going in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Chair Rabbit, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak on this item.
Great, thank you, Drew. Appreciate that, and appreciate all the public comments on that particular item. And again, I appreciate the comments made by my colleagues regarding the need to coordinate and to leave all the options on the table to make sure that we have the best project overall for the environment and for solving the issues on the corridor. So appreciate that very much. With that, we are at a point in time where I look for my any committee member comments or staff updates. Any of my colleagues have anything to share? If not, I'll look to our directors and see if they have anything to share. Seeing that no one's in the sharing mood today, we'll move on then to, you can see on the future topics on the agenda, there's about 5 things there. And of course, it may adjust and change as we go forward, depending on where we are within any one of those information items that we talked about earlier. And if there isn't anything else for the good of the order, we are adjourned. And thank you again to all the staff members for all the great work, for the public for participating so well and staying engaged, and for all my colleagues for all the work as well. So to that, till next time, thank you.